So thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure and a joy to have you here. My name is Angie Hobbs. I'm the organizer of this event with my wonderful Sheffield colleague, Dr. Josh Forstenser, who very sadly can't be with us today. His father has just been taken very, very critically ill, and Josh is with him in Paris. So we send him our thoughts and our prayers and our humanist blessings. So it seems to me that never has philosophy been needed more in our society, including in schools. What are we contending with? We're contending with fake news, the bogus talk of alternative facts and post-truth, completely self-refuting concepts. We have various forms of indoctrination, including from the far right. We need to give all children, it seems to me, and young people the inner resources to sift out fact from lies and untruths for themselves. But not just that, not just that. We already have studies which show that philosophy in schools benefits both literacy and numeracy, particularly in children from disadvantaged backgrounds. We are currently doing tests to look at the role of philosophy in schools in relation to creative imagination, empathy, and, as I've said, various forms of resilience to indoctrination. Right, so I shall start with my talk, which is on philosophy and the good life. So this is a bit of the theory behind this. What I'm interested in doing, I work particularly when I have my academic hat on. I normally, as you may know, have a public understanding of philosophy hat on, but with my academic hat on, I do a lot of work in the ethics and politics of flourishing. And it really interested me that it seemed to me that if you explored that ethical approach, then philosophy in schools seems to be a consequence of following that ethical approach. It seems to be something that ticks a lot of the ethics of flourishing and politics of flourishing boxes. But also, it seemed to me that emphasizing quite a bit of Greek philosophy is also incredibly helpful in various ways in schools. So that's my plan, is to start with a very brief outline of the ethics of flourishing, really brief, a couple of minutes, and then to look at the implications for education and why philosophy in general, and perhaps Greek philosophy in particular, are really helpful resources. Right. So we start with a quote from Plato's Gorgias. So you see how our discussion concerns that which should be of the greatest importance to any person, even if he has only a modicum of sense. That is to say, how one should live. This question is Plato's fundamental ethical starting point and is entwined with the question of what sort of person to be. And in both cases, Plato believes that we would answer that what we want is a flourishing life, to be a flourishing human. What we want is eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia is not the same thing as pleasure or even happiness. It literally means blessed by a benevolent guardian spirit, a benevolent daimon. For those of you who are currently watching his Dark Materials, you'll be very au fait with daimons at the moment. And it's a more objective than current conceptions of happiness. It's concerned with the fullest realization of one's best faculties. You can be pretty miserable and still be flourishing that day. But what does this realization involve? We first need to do some informed thinking about what our faculties are, intellectual, imaginative, and affective, as well as physical, and what social and political conditions are needed for their best actualization. It is an agent-centered approach, at least capable of taking on board the complexities of the lived human experience. And to my mind, it is more compelling than act-centered ethical theories based on notions of duties and rights. You might put Kant in that bracket, though that's fairly controversial. or of utilitarian consequences such as Bentham and Mill. Perhaps a less controversial example of duties and rights, duties-based ethics would be the Ten Commandments. So it's an agent-centered approach. It's looking at the whole person living a whole life. And it invites us to consider the structure, the shape, and the narrative of a well-lived life. And it's thus an ethical approach which has particular connections with aesthetics and with stories. And we're going to be hearing this afternoon, we've got a couple of speakers who are going to be talking quite a bit more, in more depth, about the role of stories and narratives. Now, of course, there's a philosophical question regarding the extent to which we can sculpt order out of the mess of daily existence, but we will leave that philosophical question aside for one moment. So we have an ethical approach which gets you to look at a whole person living a whole life, the narrative of a life, the shape and structure of a life. And it's also an ethical approach which positively requires us to consider the links between ethics and political theory and practice. What political and social circumstances are needed for people to actualize their potential? Good education. I think most of us in this room we'd do ourselves out of a job if we denied that one, but I believe it to be true. The opportunity to discuss and debate freely. A social setting, maybe, in order to exercise certain virtues such as justice. Aristotle's famous quote, "The human is a political animal." Often wrongly translated, man is a political animal, but it's anthropos in the Greek, it's a human. So what are the implications for education? Education will need political support, both from government, with a sort of capital P, political parties, but also from the local community, the local polis. Education should seek to enable children and young people to actualize all their faculties, intellectual, imaginative, affective, and physical. And if you agree with Plato and Aristotle that rationally guided emotional responses lead to morally appropriate choices and actions, then such intellectual and emotional development will inevitably involve some moral character training too. Michael Hand, who's going to be joining us later, has of course just written very interestingly and challengingly on that subject. And crucially, if education is conceived within the context of an ethics of flourishing, then it should assist the actualization of potential not simply as a preparation for adulthood, crucial of course so that is, but also because the years of school attendance form a substantial part of any individual's life. And in some tragic cases, of course, it's the whole of the individual's life. Some children sadly never get to live beyond their school years. So absolutely crucial that we don't just see education as a preparation for adulthood, let alone just as a preparation for entering the workforce, important though those things are. These years should be a time of flourishing in themselves, stimulating, fun, and fulfilling. And these stimulating and enjoyable years of schooling should help the young person to start to form an idea of a flourishing life, what kind of shape and narrative it might take. I'm thinking more of secondary school students there, though not entirely them. And these years should also, I think, help the young person to understand the links between individual and community. We're not going to be getting Josh's paper later, but I would urge you to look at the synopsis of what he's going to say in the booklet, because he's really, really interesting on the use of philosophy in terms of civic empowerment and democratic enhancement. And given the links between an ethics of flourishing and the idea of the shape or structure of a life, it follows that both the aesthetic and political dimension of the flourishing life will be greatly assisted through the hearing and enacting of stories. These educational requirements can effectively be supported if at least some philosophy, I would argue, is included in both primary and secondary education. Philosophy can help young people start to think about, imagine, and emotionally connect with various conceptions of a good life. It can help them think about what might be needed to realize such conceptions. It can also form part of the good life in its own right. And this can happen either in dedicated philosophy classes, whether examined or unexamined, or woven imaginatively into other subject classes, starting from as young as 7 or even earlier. We'll learn more from both Sapere and the Philosophy Foundation and Thinking Space about how young they think we can start. I would say probably even younger than 7. Now, my own, as you know, with my academic hat on, I do a lot of work on ancient Greek philosophy, so you won't be surprised at this section. Greek philosophy, in common with almost all philosophy, provides the tools for conceptual analysis and the construction and analysis of both deductive and inductive arguments. Equally important is a feature of Greek philosophy, particularly distinctive to it, the wide variety of styles in which it is written. We have the dialogues of Plato, which seek to represent, in writing, the oral debates of Socrates and his interlocutors, and I think the Philosophy Foundation are going to be talking a bit more very soon about Socrates. We have the paradoxes of Zeno. The runner cannot cross the stadium. Half the time is equal to its double. The paradoxes and aphorisms of Heraclitus. Children really, and young people, they really enjoy Heraclitus. I thoroughly recommend some Heraclitus. The road up and down is one and the same. God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace. The epic hexameters of Parmenides, for you could not recognize that which is not, nor could you mention it. And incidentally, just a brief aside, and I do have her permission to tell the story. My daughter, when she was about 7 or 8, childcare broke down over half term. So she had to come in and hear me when I was then at Warwick University give a lecture on Parmenides, and I brought her colouring books and things, but she was sort of listening vaguely. And I wrote on the board, you cannot think nothing. And I asked the students to discuss that statement and whether they could make sense of it. I also wrote up, nothing exists, and asked them to discuss that. Then I put inverted commas round nothing in each case. You cannot think nothing. Nothing exists, and I asked them to discuss those statements and whether the inverted commas made a difference. Anyway, later that evening on the phone, I heard my daughter saying with great glee, probably to her father, she now knew what her mum did all day. I talked about nothing all day long. However, the last laugh was on me, because when she got to secondary school, she got really interested in physics. Really interested. She's now doing theoretical physics at university. And she wrote, quite young, she wrote an essay on whether black holes can be said to exist. Can you ascribe existence to a black hole? And she did it all herself. I didn't help her at all. She researched it and thought about it all herself. And I was really impressed. And I kind of said to her, did you remember that lecture at all that I gave? And she didn't remember the name Parmenides, of course, but she did remember the lecture talking about whether nothing exists and whether you can think nothing. And I was by the way, none of you teachers in this room, none of you would do this. All she got, what I thought was a terrific essay, it just got, at the end, this was not what you were asked to do. Oh, dear. Anyway, I've sort of said when she wins her Nobel Prize for Physics, she can drop the teacher a little line. So children really enjoy this stuff, because encountering this wide diversity of styles serves 3 crucial purposes. The styles are fun and engaging in themselves and attract imaginative young minds. They positively invite interpretation, questions, and debate. And the sheer variety of styles helps develop suppleness of mind in pupils, and as they grow older, encourages them to reflect on what philosophy itself is and what forms it may take. And this kind of suppleness and agility of mind is, I believe, yet another of the benefits of bringing more philosophy into schooling. Now, controversial area. Well, as I said, we'll probably be hearing a bit more about this later from Michael. The dialogues of Plato in particular exemplify that philosophy is often most fruitfully undertaken in debate with others. By engaging in philosophic dialogue, pupils can hone both their specific philosophic skills and, more generally, improve their social skills and increase their social confidence. And I think there have been some studies which have already given quite interesting evidence in that direction. Pupils can come to appreciate that a good philosopher knows how to listen as well as talk. Not that all philosophers do, but that's the idea. And Plato makes sure that the main character, usually Socrates, has to converse with genuinely tough opponents whose views and manner are sometimes positively hostile to Socrates. Children and young people can learn that it is possible to disagree with someone, even robustly, without actually shouting, let alone coming to blows. Now, I was at an event, I was speaking at the Athens Democracy Forum recently in, surprise, surprise, Athens. Now, I fortunately wasn't in this discussion, but I listened to Bernard-Henri Lévy in debate, I say debate, with Steve Bannon. And that was certainly, the Thrasymachus de nos jours, I guess you could say. But that was certainly taking on a pretty tough opponent. I have to say, Bernard-Henri Lévy did well, actually. They did come quite close to blows. They got off their stools at one point and were facing up to each other really, really close. So it got quite edgy. Anyway, but the idea is you have the dialogue without coming to blows. And furthermore, the fact that Plato never appears as a speaking character in any of his dialogues means that we can never know for sure whether he agrees without qualification with any of the views that his characters express, even the character of Socrates, who should also not be confused with the historical Socrates. So the distance that Plato is careful to create between himself and his characters positively invites discussion and debate. It is a distance which opens up a space for future readers and hearers. I think this is absolutely crucial, encouraging them to think actively for themselves and question supposed authority figures, but crucially, question them in a reasoned, rigorous, and constructive way. Ancient Greek philosophy is also unashamedly bold about tackling big questions with gusto and thus taps into young people's natural curiosity, imagination, and an intellectual zest. Plato and Aristotle both say that philosophy begins with a sense of wonder, and there and other Greek thinkers' works bear witness to this. So what really exists? How do we know that it exists? How do we know that we know? What are time and space? What makes me me? Children particularly interested in the last one. And furthermore, as we've begun to see, Greek philosophy tackles these fundamental issues in ways which are hugely appealing to both primary and secondary school pupils. Paradoxes, puzzles, and puns, vivid aphorisms, powerful images like Plato's clave, fabulous stories, resonant myths. And Zeno's paradoxes are the perfect introduction to investigating time and space. Achilles cannot overtake the tortoise. The moving arrow is motionless. That's my favorite. Mathematicians are still arguing about the moving arrow is motionless. They're still writing papers on it. And Heraclitus is ideal for exploring questions of identity. You cannot step into the same river twice. And his student or pupil, Cratylus, you cannot step into the same river once. Because if everything's always moving, then rivers can't even form. You can't even form. There are no identities at all. The sun is new every day. An otherwise disaffected teenager, and I've tried this out on many, can be intrigued by Heraclitus's more psychedelic pronouncements, such as immortals are mortals, mortals immortal, living their death, dying their life. That's a brilliant one to chuck at stroppy 16-year-old. And as I always tell my students at university, you need never, ever take an illegal psychedelic drug again, because just go out with the pre-Socratic philosophers in your pocket on a Friday evening. You don't need those stupid pills that are going to fry your brains. And what better way to direct young minds onto issues surrounding truth and falsity than through the Cretan liar paradox? I always lie. Now, I was thinking about this on the train. I won't name them, but certain politicians at the moment, if they said I always lie, would they, for the first time in their life, be telling the truth? Anyway, for young people raised on Harry Potter, his Dark Materials again, it's a good rendition, I think. Anyway, Doctor Who, The Hunger Games, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings. For those children, imaginative leaps through time and space to fantastical other worlds are an enticing challenge, not an obstacle. They really enjoy metaphysics. They're natural metaphysicians. Tackling such profound conundra fulfills the twin aim mentioned at the outset, helping to actualize the young person's potential, and doing it in such an enjoyable way that the classroom becomes not only a preparation for future flourishing as an adult, but a place where the child can flourish as a child. And I would also say a place where the classroom is a place where teachers can flourish as teachers, because I think let's not leave teachers out of this. I think getting more philosophy into schools in a variety of ways also makes teaching more fun, can help teachers to flourish. And as we touched on above, Greek philosophy, I'm just looking at the clock, so I'm going to be so strict with everybody else. I've got till 22. I've got 2.5 minutes. As we touched on above, Greek philosophy is especially useful, as it often deploys historical, fictional, and mythical examples of characters and lives to help us understand what model of flourishing we find attractive and how best to achieve it, and just as saliently, what to avoid. Now, these exemplar stories allow, in the main, slightly older pupils to start to form the notions of the narrative shape and structure of a well-lived life that we saw are integral to any ethics and politics of flourishing. And they're also naturally appealing to young minds and properly handle their excellent pedagogic tools. There are pitfalls, and I've put up a paper by Karen Davis which discusses some of the pitfalls, but I think many of the pitfalls, namely the wrong, bad role models or narrow role models or only looking at one role model, they can be avoided, providing the teacher provides a wide variety of role models for their pupils to discuss, and that there is rigorous debate about the pros and cons of the different role models. And Plato in particular shows us how what we believe affects how we live and who we are, and also how who we are and how we live affects what we believe. So philosophy in general then, and perhaps particularly Greek philosophy, is one of the best subjects for showing young people there are different ways of living, being, and thinking than those immediately on offer in their local postcode. It can extend their imaginative grasp of possible lives. That might be the most important thing of all. We are not just the product of our genes, or for the Greeks, they would say our blood or our semen or our bone marrow and environment. Reason can provide at least a partial way out, but only if reason is properly trained. I have 1 minute. Philosophy in schools and 21st century challenges. Because I think philosophy can provide children tend to be young, they can provide children and young people with the mental resources which may help them. It's a controversial area. I'm not making any wild claims. It might help them to resist indoctrination. It should certainly be tested. It is indeed being tested at the moment. We need to start to educate children in primary school in the analysis of concepts and the construction and analysis of arguments, in order to enable them to question authority figures, perhaps sometimes silently if it's dangerous to question them out loud, and ask themselves whether there is any good reason to believe what they are being told, whether the authority figure is a mainstream teacher or politician, or religious or nationalist extremist. Sadly, the boundaries between a mainstream politician and nationalist extremist are becoming ever more blurred, but you get the idea. And this needs to happen early. And this approach, I think, has the great advantage of being inclusive. All children would ideally receive this training. So, and I think it, to my mind, it contrasts favorably with the current prevent strategy. Philosophy in general and Greek philosophy in particular, as we touched on at the beginning, can provide young people with the resources needed to scrutinize talk of alternative facts, post-fact, post-truth. It can help them to understand that the very phrases post-fact and post-truth are arguably self-refuting, because it's not the use of such phrases implicitly claiming that this very state of affairs is itself a fact, is itself true. So to sum up, I think we have an ethical framework which can accommodate and indeed facilitate the suppleness and agility of mind, which are plainly needed in the 21st century to cope with the huge global shifts that are going on. Many philosophers and philosophical approaches can be fruitfully deployed, but I think that an overall package, ancient Greek philosophy, offers some fantastic treasures. And these philosophical approaches do not all need to be examined. We're going to be hearing about a great new examination that John Taylor has brought in, I think absolutely commendably, but it's also important, I think, to have unexamined philosophy in schools. So to conclude, I submit that a greater provision of philosophy in schools would facilitate both the immediate living and the developing understanding of a good life by all who studied it and all who taught it, and would nourish and sustain both pupils and teachers and help prepare them for what I think might be quite a few turbulent years ahead. Thank you very much.